Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
At my brother Ethan's birthday dinner, he lifted his glass in that smooth way he copies from business shows and said that maybe his sister should finally sell him her dyeing business. And the table fell into that polite roar people make when the most powerful person in the room decides a joke is safe to laugh at. While I sat there smiling as if my face belonged to someone else and reminded myself to breathe slowly because I knew if I reacted the way I wanted to, the night would end with a scene that he would twist into another story about the dropout who cannot handle a little banter. I grew up listening to my parents compare us, as if that was a normal family hobby, and somewhere between his Ivy League acceptance and his polished graduation photos, they rewired their brains so that every stumble of mine proved a character flaw and every wobble of his proved courage. And when I left college to keep my grandfather's small company alive after he got sick, they called it quitting, while they called Ethan's startup pivots bold even when bold meant bouncing rent checks and asking friends to float him until a raise that never arrived, and I swallowed it because someone had to run payroll and file the taxes and meet the insurance guy at 7 in the morning when no one else would. So when he offered to buy me out in front of family and friends and old neighbors who still remember the day my grandfather picked me up from school in a van that smelled like printer ink and pride, I let the first wave of heat pass through me and stared at the candle wax because counting drips was safer than counting insults, and then I did what I always do when I am cornered, which is to act like I am comfortable. Because nothing breaks a bully like a calm voice that does not tremble. I stood, raised my glass, and thanked Ethan for caring so much about the health of my so-called dying business that he wanted to keep it in the family, and the room chuckled in that average way that says we are all adults here. And then I added that since we were telling the truth tonight, I wanted to thank him for the lesson he taught me about valuation last winter when he texted me before dawn asking if my dying business could spot his company a short-term bridge because his accounts were frozen by a vendor dispute and a payroll was due that afternoon, and the laughter thinned the way a sweater thins when you pull at a loose thread. Because older relatives know the sound of the word payroll in a sentence, and they know it never shows up in a joke unless someone bled for it. Ethan blinked the way he does when he is deciding whether to charm or to scold. My mother said my name in that careful tone that means stop, and my father shifted the conversation to cake and speeches and gratitude. And I sat down with my pulse steady because I had not lied or dramatized or even yelled. I had simply placed a quiet fact on the table and let it sit there like a bowl of cold soup no one wanted to claim, and in that moment I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness and not fury, just the knowledge that the version of me they keep around for laughs could not survive a room where I kept telling the truth. I did not stay for the extra photos or the second round of toasts where everyone tries to outdo each other with stories of childhood genius, because I had a meeting early the next morning that mattered more than the optics of being a good sport. And I wanted a full night of sleep so I could show up with my head clear and my phone charged, since the only thing worse than being underestimated is being unprepared when the underestimation ends, and I had decided that it would end on my timeline, not his. Driving home, I thought about the word dropout and how small it feels in other people's mouths, and I rolled it around like a chipped coin because sometimes it buys you entry into rooms where no one thinks to search your pockets. And I promised myself that the next time Ethan tried to make a public purchase of my dignity, he would find that the price changed overnight, not out of spite, but because value is a slippery thing when you only measure it with diplomas and press releases. And I had spent years measuring it with boxes shipped on time and people paid on Friday and problems solved before they grew fangs. I set my alarm for before sunrise, checked the folder on my kitchen table where I had printed what needed to be signed even though I could have done it all digitally, brewed coffee I barely touched, and stared at the dark window like it might answer a question I had been afraid to ask, which was whether the life I had been holding together with both hands could be something other than a punchline. And somewhere between that thought and the soft buzz of my phone announcing a new email, I decided I was done asking permission to keep what I had built. When I finally lay down, the room felt quiet in a way that did not scare me, and I swore I could hear my grandfather's voice telling me that steadiness wins races no one else bothers to run, and I believed him more in that moment than I ever have. Because for the first time I was not trying to prove anything to my parents or to Ethan or to the crowd that claps at the right moments. I was only trying to hold my own line, and that felt like power rather than stubbornness, which is not a feeling I get often when family is involved. By the time Dawn showed up like an unwelcome auditor and my doorbell finally rang, I had already sent what needed to be sent and confirmed what needed to be confirmed, and as I walked to the door I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because nothing sharpens a person like public humiliation followed by a good night's sleep, and when I opened it and saw who was on my porch, their faces pinched with urgency they tried to hide, I knew that the joke from the night before had finally grown teeth, and I was not the one it planned to bite. When I opened the door and saw Ethan standing slightly behind our parents with that tight smile that tries to hide urgency, I did not invite them in right away. Because I wanted a second to hear my own thoughts before their voices started filling the hallway with explanations and conditions, and that familiar tone that says this is for your own good. So I told them I needed a minute to put the coffee off the burner, and I stepped back into the kitchen where the folder sat exactly where I had left it, with the signatures still damp from the previous afternoon and the cover letter that had taken me 3 quiet nights to phrase in a way that sounded calm instead of triumphant, and I realized I should start at the beginning rather than leap to the end. Because if I did not walk myself through how we got here, I might waste what I had earned by trying to soothe people who never once tried to soothe me. My so-called dying business is not glamorous, and it never will be, because it builds its days out of things no one posts about, like labels that do not smudge and packing inserts that do not confuse warehouse staff, and software reminders that keep compliance from slipping, and the only reason anyone thinks it is dying is that it is the kind of company that looks boring in a holiday photo, while the kind of company Ethan loves looks exciting until a vendor freezes an account or a key hire resigns and the pitch deck starts to feel like a costume, and when my grandfather handed me the keys he said that the work would always be invisible unless it failed, which meant that if I was doing it well, people would assume it was easy or outdated or both. Over the past few years, I stopped arguing with that assumption and started building around it, picking up contracts other people ignored because the margins were not flashy, renegotiating delivery windows in exchange for quieter price moves, piloting a small inventory program for medical suppliers who were tired of paying panic fees every time a storm closed a highway, and while no single decision looked like a victory, the slow stack of them turned into something steadier than the family believed, and when a regional logistics firm reached out asking if I would consider a partnership that looked like a lifeline from the outside and like leverage from where I sat, I asked very careful questions and pushed every clause that touched control. Because I had learned the hard way that money without respect is just a leash with a nicer buckle. By the time Ethan made his joke at the party, the documents were already through legal and the bank had already confirmed the structure, which kept me as the person who signs the checks and hires the people and says no when someone tries to dangle a shiny discount in exchange for terms that make my stomach turn. And while I did take that early morning call last winter when Ethan whispered that he was in a bind and promised me this was only for a week, I did not hand him cash out of loyalty. I handed him a clean short-term note with collateral that he insisted was a formality, and I insisted was the only way I sleep at night. And I filed exactly what needed to be filed, because I understand that favors without paper become weapons at the next holiday. Standing in my kitchen with my family on the porch and the coffee cooling for show, I scrolled to the draft email I had written the night before, the one that attached the certification of my new partnership and politely updated the notice address for a few vendors who happened to overlap with Ethan's suppliers. And I added a single sentence that any accounts associated with entities under his control should now require prepayment until past obligations are resolved, which is not vengeance in the dramatic sense and not cruelty for the pleasure of it, but a boundary written in adult language that says I am not your safety net anymore, and I am not your punchline anymore either. And I hit send because I knew exactly what would follow once the morning rounds landed in a few inboxes. I let them in after that, and there was the dance we always do, the one where my mother starts with concern and slides into direction, where my father tests out the word opportunity like he is doing me a favor by pronouncing it correctly. And where Ethan pretends that last night was a misunderstanding while also keeping his palms open for whatever I might place there. But this time I did not fill the silence they left for me. I waited until they asked the real question, which is whether I would consider selling the company to the family so we could keep things simple and dignified and unified. And I watched the way Ethan's eyes flickered when I said the word collateral as if I had switched the tablecloth without warning. And I told him that his note was now past due and that I had no interest in a sale. Not to him and not to anyone who thinks my work is an embarrassment until the bills come due. The revenge, if you want to call it that, landed not with a shout but with a soft tap of confirmations arriving one after another on my phone. Each one a small acknowledgement that the rules had shifted and that the doors he walked through on charm alone would now ask for proof. And as I slid the folder across the table and invited him to read the pages he once called unnecessary, I felt the room tilt in that subtle way it does when someone finally recognizes the ground they are standing on. And I ended the meeting by reminding him, very clearly and very calmly, that the clock on his default had begun, which is when my mother asked what default I was talking about and my father asked if this was strictly necessary. And Ethan asked whether we could handle this as a family, and I smiled the kind of smile you make when the game you never agreed to play finally shows its score, and I said that we absolutely would, because family, after all, means honoring the commitments you sign. And then my phone lit with a new message from a name he could not afford to ignore, and I slid it toward him without a word as the color left his face and the room finally went quiet. The thing about family emergencies is that they always arrive wrapped in politeness first, as if by knocking softly and smiling they can disguise the panic that sent them over in the first place. But when my parents stood on my porch with Ethan hovering behind them, it was impossible to miss the urgency in their eyes, and though they began with small talk about how the party had been a success and how everyone enjoyed seeing me, their voices carried a tremor that betrayed the truth, so I waited for them to stop pretending before I offered coffee, because I knew that whatever had brought them here had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with desperation. It was Ethan who finally cracked first, leaning forward in his chair like a man trying to disguise a confession as casual interest, and he told me that his new firm was facing some temporary liquidity issues due to market timing. A phrase he had probably rehearsed in the mirror, but I could see the corners of the story unraveling the moment he shifted from liquidity to family unity, because I had heard that kind of language before, both from him and from every polished article that praises risk. Until the risks fall due, and I sat there quietly because I wanted to hear the full performance before I chose where to place the knife of truth. My mother chimed in next, insisting that this was an opportunity for us to finally combine resources and present ourselves as one strong family brand. A phrase that nearly made me laugh, because she has spent my entire adult life making sure my name carried the quiet weight of disappointment, and now suddenly she wanted to wrap it into a bundle with Ethan's failing venture and parade it as a show of solidarity. But I kept my face neutral and nodded at the right moments, because letting people think they are still controlling the room is often the best way to watch them reveal how little control they actually have. My father, who has always been the negotiator in the family even though most of his deals are little more than half promises sealed over drinks, finally lowered his voice and said that it would be best for everyone if I considered signing over controlling interest in my business, just until Ethan could stabilize his, and then of course everything could be rebalanced in the future. Which is a phrase that has stolen more futures than it has ever secured, and I stared at him for a long moment before asking whether this was really about Ethan's firm or about the fact that the vendors had already begun demanding prepayment from any company tied to his name, because I could see the flicker in Ethan's eyes that confirmed he already knew my emails had reached their targets. The silence that followed was thick, not because they had nothing to say, but because for the first time in years they could not rely on me to fill it with nervous explanations or with concessions that would make everyone more comfortable. And when Ethan finally admitted that the vendors were pulling back and that a major investor was threatening to walk, I felt the weight of every smirk and every patronizing toast fall away, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been underestimated for too long and finally has the chance to let the truth stand unembellished. And I told him that while I was sympathetic to his situation, my company was no longer available for purchase or rescue. Not to him and not to anyone who treated it like a joke until the moment it became necessary. My mother began to cry in that sharp way that feels like accusation rather than grief, insisting that I was punishing the family for years of misunderstandings and that surely I could find it in my heart to show generosity now when it mattered. And my father leaned forward as if to remind me that one day I might need them, but what neither of them understood was that I had already spent years needing them and receiving nothing but lectures about resilience, and that I had built my resilience into contracts, partnerships, and balances that now shielded me from the exact storm that was tearing through Ethan's carefully curated image. I did not raise my voice, I did not deliver a speech, I simply reminded them that Ethan had given me a promissory note when I loaned him money the previous winter, and that note was past due, which meant I had every right to demand repayment before discussing any new arrangement, and when my father sputtered about how family should not bring paperwork into private matters, I reminded him that it was Ethan who had first chosen to mix business with family when he stood at his birthday dinner and reduced my company to a punchline, and that I had simply followed his lead by ensuring that facts, not emotions, governed our dealings from then on. Ethan tried one last maneuver, asking me if I truly wanted to see his reputation collapse, if I truly wanted to be the reason investors walked and employees panicked, and I leaned forward, finally, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made him look away. And I told him that I did not have the power to ruin him because he had done that himself, that all I had done was withdraw the safety net he thought he could mock and still rely on, and in that instant the color drained from his face and I knew that the balance of power had shifted in a way that could never be undone. When they left, the house felt lighter, not because the conflict was resolved, but because the roles had finally reversed, and for the first time I was not the child being lectured or the dropout being corrected. I was the one holding the terms, the deadlines, and the leverage, and I knew they would be back, because desperation never knocks just once, but when it returned, I would be ready with more than silence. I would be ready with the next move, the one that would make sure the table stayed turned for good. By the afternoon of that same day, I stopped waiting for anyone to come to their senses and moved the plan from quiet preparation to open execution, because I had learned over years of being patronized that dignity is not given after an apology. It is taken by setting terms and keeping them, so I forwarded the default notice on Ethan's note to my attorney with a simple instruction to file the lien we had prepared months ago when he first signed. I scheduled a compliance check with my new partners to flag any overlap with Ethan's entities and to route those accounts to prepayment only. I asked my controller to pause future deliveries to one distributor that had started bouncing invoices from Ethan's side ventures. And I drafted a message to key suppliers explaining that while I valued long relationships, I would not subsidize anyone's arrogance disguised as innovation, which felt less like a declaration of war and more like finally locking the door to a house I had kept open for far too long. The next piece was quieter but sharper, because I knew reputation would do more damage than any courtroom threat, so I called the operations lead at a client Ethan had been courting for months, a woman who had once told me that competence was her love language. And I walked her through a simple continuity offer that promised on-time fulfillment, clean terms, and a discount that only triggered if we hit flawless delivery for a full quarter, and by the time we hung up she had already forwarded my proposal to her procurement team with a note that said she trusted me to do what I said, which was the kind of sentence that makes a lifetime of being dismissed feel suddenly very small. And which I admit I read 3 times before archiving, because it felt like air after a long hold underwater. I knew Ethan would hear about the lien before dinner because people in his circle treat legal filings like weather alerts, and I knew he would react with the same frantic optimism he uses when a pitch goes sideways, which is why I had the next step ready. A neat little packet that included the signed partnership documents, a schedule of his missed payments, and an invitation to a meeting at my office the following morning with a simple line that said we should discuss a path that protects employees and customers. Not because I wanted to save him, but because I wanted to make clear that there were only two doors left, the one where he accepted reality and kept something of his name, and the one where he resisted and watched that name show up on paperwork he wished he had never signed. That evening my phone lit with messages from relatives pretending to check on me while fishing for gossip, and I ignored them, not out of spite but out of focus, because the only thing worse than being the family scapegoat is being the family's emergency generator. And I had decided I would no longer power their stories, so I shut off the noise, reviewed the employee retention plan I had drafted for the handful of people at his firm who actually kept the lights on, and finalized the letters, offering them roles on my team with salaries that were fair rather than flamboyant, and with a quiet clause that honored their seniority if they made the move within 2 weeks, which felt ruthless on paper and merciful in practice. Because all I was doing was opening a lifeboat before the ship captain admitted he had hit a rock. When Ethan walked into my office the next morning without our parents, his jaw tight and his eyes calculating, I handed him the packet and watched him flip through the pages with a speed that told me he was searching for a loophole rather than absorbing the meaning. And I waited until he reached the memo about the trademark he had pledged as collateral before I explained, in a tone I would have used with any client, that default triggered a transfer, that I did not want his brand because it was more style than substance, and that I was offering him a release if he unwound the entities that owed me money and signed a non-disparagement that covered every platform he loves to perform on. And for the first time he looked up like a person rather than a persona and asked whether I truly intended to go that far, and I answered that I was going exactly as far as he had pushed me, no farther and no softer. He tried to bluff by saying his lead investor would bury me in countersuits and press, a threat that might have worked a year ago when I still needed the room to like me, but I simply slid my phone across the desk with an email open from that very investor, the one copied on my continuity proposal, and looped into a conversation about consolidating orders under my contract to avoid disruption. And as Ethan stared at the screen, calculating how many exits were left and how much of his image could be salvaged, I told him he had until the end of the weekend to choose whether to sign the release and keep his reputation mostly intact or refuse and watch the paperwork move without him, and the look he gave me was not anger or shock, it was recognition. Because he finally saw that the dropout had become the person writing his options, and then the door opened and the investor stepped in, nodded at me, and asked whether we were ready to finalize the transition, which is when Ethan swallowed hard and said that he needed a moment, and I told him he could have until Monday morning, but not a minute more. Monday arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that does not ask for courage so much as it demands follow-through, and when Ethan walked into the conference room with a face that tried to look confident while his eyes scanned for exits, the investor already seated beside me and my attorney ready with a pen that would not hesitate, I understood that the moment I had been building toward since the first time someone called me a dropout had finally shown up exactly on time, which meant the only job left was to keep my voice even and my terms simpler than his excuses. I began not with accusations but with logistics, because people like Ethan lose their footing when the conversation refuses to climb onto the stage they built for drama, so I explained that the lien had perfected, that the collateral he pledged no longer lived in the land of threats, but in the land of transfers, that the vendors whose patience he had treated like a bottomless well would be handled through our continuity agreements, and that the employees who woke each morning wondering whether paychecks would clear would receive written offers by close of business, with seniority recognized and healthcare uninterrupted. And while he tried to interrupt with a speech about vision and timing and market cycles, I kept moving. Because the fastest way to drain grandstanding is to pour schedules, deliverables, and signatures over it until the steam runs out. The offer I slid across the table was not the ambush he expected because I did not need to humiliate him to win. I only needed him to make a choice under conditions he could not spin. So the release letter pledged that I would not pursue the trademark transfer if he unwound the entities that owed me money, returned the equipment pledged under the note, delivered a written non-disparagement that covered platforms, panels, and pitches, and sent a staff-wide message acknowledging the transition. and thanking my company for stabilizing payroll, and in exchange I would license back the brand name solely for a wind-down period, after which it would retire rather than be paraded as a zombie, because I wanted closure, not a trophy. He tried the last weapon he had left, which was shame dressed as concern, asking whether I truly wanted to be the reason our parents felt humiliated in front of their friends when the story reached them without a soft landing. And I answered that I was not choosing humiliation for anyone, I was choosing clean math over sentimental debt, that I was done paying interest on a narrative I never wrote, and that if our parents needed a softer landing, they could try telling the truth for once, which is that their brilliant son leveraged his sister's so-called dying business and defaulted while she kept other people's lights on, and while the room went quiet enough to hear the paper slide under his hand, the investor cleared his throat and said he would be moving his business under my contracts regardless of whether Ethan signed, which turned the choice from painful to obvious and left him without a single place to hide. He signed, because bluster cannot outvote a calendar and a paycheck, and when the ink dried I did not gloat or deliver a speech. I simply handed him a copy for his records and a printed note that said his building access would remain for the week only so that he could pack with dignity, and I sent my attorney to file, my controller to run the retention letters, and my operations lead to schedule the first joint call with clients whose only demand had ever been predictability, and while my phone lit with owners and managers who had waited a long time to see someone choose dull competence over shiny chaos, I allowed myself one long breath in which I thanked the version of me who stayed steady every time a room laughed. By evening, my parents called with the voice they reserve for public relations emergencies, asking whether we could all meet to craft a shared statement that would protect the family name. Perhaps even a small dinner where Ethan could toast to new beginnings, and I could announce a graceful exit that would sound magnanimous to anyone who did not know what had really happened. And I told them that the only statement I would be making had already gone out to staff and clients, that it used dull words like continuity and service levels on purpose, and that if they wanted a toast, they could raise a glass to contracts honored, because that is the only kind of celebration I attend now. And when my mother began to cry, I did not step into the familiar role of fixer. I let the silence tell her that the bank of my patience had closed its lobby and posted new hours for appointments only. The next morning, I stood in front of the people who had kept Ethan's office running while he chased panels and headlines, and I told them that I was not here to be a savior. I was here to be a boss who did what she promised, that their work would speak louder than my surname, that the boring parts would be celebrated because they are the parts that keep rent paid and kids in school and cars insured, and when I finished, I offered something that tasted like revenge only if you had ever been belittled for doing quiet work, a scholarship in my grandfather's name for any employee who wanted to pursue a certificate, a license, or a class that made their job easier and their confidence heavier. Because I wanted the circle to close on purpose rather than by accident, and I wanted the story our family tells about me to become irrelevant next to the story these people will tell about themselves. Later, when I finally sat alone and looked at the contract packet, at the neat lines where his signature met mine, I thought about the birthday toast that began this unraveling and about the way the room laughed while I learned, in real time, how to win without yelling. And I realized that the sweetest part was not the lien or the licensing or the investor shifting his weight toward my side of the table. It was the knowledge that I will never again ask permission to keep what I built, that I will never again pretend a joke is harmless because it happens over cake, and that when they come knocking, as they inevitably will whenever the next storm hits, the door they used to walk through without knocking will stay locked until they learn the password. Which is not apology or flattery or family, but respect written in full sentences and signed at the bottom in ink that does not smear.